Today we're making Louisiana-style hot sauce using home kitchen equipment, and we start with the pepper mash. Traditionally, just fresh red cayenne peppers, which brings a moderate heat, a bright clean flavour, and some fruity notes. Optionally, Habanero peppers, which brings a more intense heat with some tropical citrus-like notes. You can go for whatever ratio you want. Today we're doing 3:1, 3 parts being the cayenne. We remove the seeds and stems for texture, ribs and membrane to avoid the sharp heat. Traditionally, Louisiana hot sauce relies on aging, often in oak barrels, for several months to allow the heat to mellow and flavors to develop. In the home kitchen, without the oak barrel, we remove the sharpness at the source. If you want more heat, use more chilies, so you get a more balanced, proportionate increase in flavors. Perfect. Pesto and water, and we start making our mash. The pounding and grinding motions will puncture and bruise the cell walls, releasing a lot more flavors. If you're doing a large batch with a food processor, I recommend that you bruise them with the back of your knife briefly before adding them to blitz. Here, I've measured 3% salt to the weight of the combined chilies, and we'll add them gradually. A, to start the mixing process, and B, to give us more friction. And because this would go through the food processor eventually, the objective of the exercise here is simply to bruise them to release flavors. Perfect. Straight to our sterilized jar. Now, 2 optional ingredients. Dry garlic powder for some savory depth, dried onion powder for some subtle aromatic background. And the reason why we're using dried instead of fresh, besides better moisture control, is that we want to mimic the effect from barrel aging, giving us more mellowed flavors. Now, instead of weeks and months of fermentation after the addition of vinegar and sometimes heat treatment, both of which contribute to slowing down the fermentation process, we're going to front load the fermentation at room temperature for 48 hours to further mellow the heat and to develop some complexity and tang, both of which we'll address further down the line. We add the rest of the 3% salt. This will draw out moisture and inhibit spoilage. And we add some brown sugar, once again 3% to the weight of the chili mix. And this would serve as the food for the natural bacteria to get the fermentation process started, adding a subtle caramel note in the process. And because this is a short fermentation, it's of vital importance that you give this a very, very thorough mix. Add some ceramic weight, keep everything submerged. Lid on, and because the fermentation that's about to happen will produce gas, it's important that you either use a fermentation lid or simply cover this with some cloth to allow air to escape. I'll see you in 2 days. After 2 days, we have some mild tang and we've built some complexity. Now, we solve for consistency. Now, we solve for complexity. First up, we have some malt vinegar. Traditionally, you would use distilled vinegar. Malt vinegar, made from barley to beer, then to vinegar, is often aged for several months to develop that distinct, malty, slightly sweet and complex tang. So we're in essence outsourcing parts of the barrel aging to the vinegar. And to really mop everything up, we're simply going to clean our blender with the malt vinegar. Next up, tomato puree for richness, umami, and of course, the deep color. Next up, a different acidity which reinforces the citrus acidity of the chilies. We have some fresh lime juice. Next up, Worcestershire sauce, which is fermented and often aged for up to 18 months, once again outsourcing the barrel aging, and this would bring the tang, the umami, the complexity. Next up, smoked paprika for smokiness, some warm spice, and color. Next up, molasses. If you can't find molasses, use brown sugar. This would bring a very deep caramelized sweetness. And bearing in mind, most of the brown sugar we added 2 days ago would have been eaten during the fermentation process by now. So this will not make the sauce overly sweet. Now, we bring in some heat gradually. A, to fully stop the fermentation process. B, to let all those new complex flavors and the flavors we developed over the 2-day period to really melt together. And C, to mellow the new sharpness we just introduced slightly, again, mimicking the effect of the barrel aging. And we simmer this very gently for 10 minutes, stirring occasionally to prevent the bottom from catching. After 10 minutes, you taste to adjust the seasoning, let this cool down to room temperature before transferring this to your sterilized jars, and this is Louisiana-style hot sauce.